Okay, I think we're going to make a start because we're already running a bit behind. So welcome everyone to the second session. My name is John Vella and I'm a professor of law at the Faculty of Law, and I'm also a director for law at the Center for Business Taxation. So this morning in the first session we spoke mostly about substantive issues. So we spoke mostly about international tax rules, and we saw how these rules have undergone a period of unprecedented change. So the rules have changed to an unprecedented degree from 2012 onwards. But there's actually been also significant change in who makes the rules and in which forum those rules are made. So if you cast your minds back to the carefree, innocent days before BEPS, most decisions were taken by the OECD about rules. But when the BEPS project was launched, for the first time, the countries involved in the process were going to include non-OECD G20 countries. And it's easy to forget, but at the time, this was considered to be quite a big deal. So I remember one of Manal's predecessors, Jeffrey Owens, going on about this at a conference in Vienna at the time, saying, look, don't underestimate how important this is. This isn't just OECD countries. Now it's OECD countries plus, importantly, BRIC countries, so OECD non-G20 countries. But change did not stop there. So a few years after, we had the inclusive framework, which, as we just heard, now includes 147 countries. But again, change did not stop there. And as you know, there is currently a process ongoing to move more of the standard setting to the UN. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this session. So we have three speakers who are right in the thick of it. The first speaker is Michael Lennard, who, let me get your title right, Michael is the Chief of International Tax Cooperation at the UN, so he really is right in the thick of it, and he was amongst other things, the 2023 Tax Notes International Tax Person of the Year. Next up is Chenai Mukumba, who's the Executive Director at Tax Justice Network Africa, and as you will hear, Chenai really has been at the heart of much that's been going on in this space. And finally, we have Philip Baker Casey, who, as I'm sure all of you know, is a barrister at Field Court Chambers and also a visiting professor at Oxford. So we're going to follow the structure we had in the first session. Speakers are going to speak for about 15 minutes each, or up to 15 minutes each, and then we'll open up for questions. We'll start with Michael.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the invitation. I'm going to speak a little bit about the past, the present, and to the extent we know it, the future of some of the UN developments in this area. And I'm not going to go through all these resolutions in detail. I've made them clickable because it's very hard to click on the UN document system, so I've tried to find places where you can look at these. And the first resolution I mentioned there is 69313, the first two digits of the sessions of the relevant General Assembly of 2015, which set out very clearly the importance of international tax cooperation. It was a consensus GA resolution. It followed the Addis Ababa Financing for Development Conference, where there was a strong call from the developing world, including the G77 and China, which is over 130 countries, for the upgrade of the UN Committee of Experts, which is a guidance body that I'm secretary to, into an intergovernmental body. And that was rejected in the Addis meeting. It was quite contentious, and I think some of the roots of what are happening now can be found in that process. And I've been in the UN for 18 years, and for all of those years, developing countries have been seeking an intergovernmental tax process at the UN. So it's no surprise that we've come to where we are, except that now it's not just about upgrading the UN Tax Committee, it's about a plenary of up to the full membership of the UN working on international tax cooperation. So the next big development was in 30th December 2022, where the General Assembly agreed by consensus. Most people think it was by vote, it was by consensus. Doesn't mean every country was happy with it, but no country pushed it to a vote. Decided to have the Secretary-General do a report on international tax cooperation. And that report, which is linked there, basically, and the reason is because the GA resolution that the report was responding said, we don't think there is any inclusive and effective body on international tax cooperation. And the Secretary-General's report agreed with that and said, yes, neither in the OECD, nor in the UN, nor anywhere else is there a body where you can fully participate from nose to tail, including the agenda setting, including the deliberations, including the first drafting, including the administration, by right and without preconditions. So that responded to the call, and it gave three options, and I think Chenai will talk more about them, so I'll just briefly mention. The first option is there should be a UN plenary body developing a general UN tax convention, potentially quite broad. That's the sort of the general option. The second option was to have a framework convention with protocols. And the idea there particularly was you don't have to do everything at once. You can complete the framework, which would have broad obligations, and then you can deal in specific terms with protocols as and when they're seen as most important to the membership. And the third option was that you just have basically an area, a framework where countries can discuss tax matters but not coming up with treaties. Not having any sort of legal norm-setting role as such. And not surprisingly, most developed countries favoured that third option, which some called the talk shop. And most developing countries initially favoured the first option, a general convention. I actually think a lot of them really favoured the second option to begin with, but preferred to put forward an ambit claim on the general convention. But actually I think they saw the value in not trying to do too much too soon, and I think the experience of the IF might have informed that things are always going to be a lot harder than you initially think when you start to negotiate a complex tax matter. And that actually was, as I say, the recommendation of the Secretary-General's report. That was taken up in the next resolution there, which was 22nd of December 2023. There was a scurry of activity. All of these resolutions that are a bit contentious happened late in the year because there was a lot of time trying to get a consensus, and sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. In this case, it didn't, and it ended up being voted. And the vote was 111 countries for, 46 against and 10 abstentions. That means, because you don't count abstentions as votes, that 70% of the UN countries present and voting actually voted for this framework and protocol option. And in the second committee, which is the preliminary committee, it was even higher. It was 72% with 125 countries voting for it. So I think the main lesson is you should listen to what they're saying. We should look at that resolution. And I think it's a very moderate resolution. And one thing a lot of people don't know is that you have a process if you can't reach consensus where you have someone, a coordinator from Egypt, as it turned out, was trying to get a resolution that all countries could agree by consensus. That wasn't possible. And the African group which pushed this, and the developing countries which supported them, nearly every developing country supported them, could have at that point said, okay, we'll go back to our original resolution. They didn't. They actually put forward the resolution which was an attempted consensus resolution as their new resolution. So again, it shows they're trying to be reasonable, they're trying to take into account that this should be a resolution that has the broadest possible acceptance. And this is the resolution established a member state, this is very UN talk, led, open-ended, I don't say there, open-ended means that it's open to all member states, it's got nothing to do with time. Ad hoc committee to develop terms of reference for a UN Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation by August of this year. So what that means is they're saying we want a UN tax convention, we want terms of reference, and we have a committee to which all countries can participate, and also observers, which have made some good contributions from business, from academia, from other aspects of civil society, non-government organisations. And we want those terms of reference to be completed this year in August, and then the General Assembly will convene later this year. It could actually be next year, but likely will be very late this year, and shall decide whether to have commence the actual negotiations of the convention, and what should be some of the terms of reference for that. And that can include procedural things such as decision making, but also, what should some of the aspects of the Framework Convention will be? What should some of the protocols, the early protocols, which are looked at? Later protocols will be dealt with by a conference of parties once everything's in force. So the ad hoc committee had its organisational meeting on the 20th to the 22nd of February. And most people don't realise that in its report it said that it would try to get a consensus, but it would take all reasonable efforts to get a consensus, but bearing in mind the need to complete the negotiations, this is the negotiations on the terms of reference, within the period that has been allotted. Because there is a general feeling amongst a lot of developing countries, while they do want to have a convention as broadly acceptable as possible, that if you make consensus a demand, then it actually encourages the countries that want nothing to happen. It becomes effectively a veto. So consensus is something you should seek, but you need some sort of backup. And in the UN, it is the majority rule in the General Assembly. But again, most people don't know that about 80% of General Assembly resolutions are by consensus. Of those that aren't, they could be 50% plus one. But in actual fact, nearly all of them are about 2/3 of the UN membership, partly because they are favoured by developing countries, but also there's a recognition there's no point in pushing forward a resolution unless you've got sufficiently wide support within the committee. So it then had its sort of substantive scoping of possible terms of reference in its meeting in April, May. And then it actually has to start making decisions, which will be reflected in its report in the session which is in New York, scheduled for 29th of July to 16th of August. It will then do the report by August. That'll get translated into the 6 languages, I think it is, of the UN, which is actually, I think, a very positive thing, that the major documents in the UN will be translated not just into, for example, French or even Spanish, but into some of the other languages as well. There's been a 0 draft of the terms of reference which has come out, and that calls for written comments from anybody who's interested, and that's due today. Last night they had 20 responses, including for some very interesting corporate and other responses, and there'll be a lot more coming today. And then there'll be a draft for discussion drawing upon those inputs. It's very important that the resolution recommends 78-230 recognise the importance of input from civil society, which means business, academics and NGOs. I think there's a strong recognition of that. So a draft for discussion will be circulated to be confirmed, the 15th of July, before the discussions/negotiations start in earnest at the end of July. In the last session, the ad hoc committee discussed some possible topics for high-level commitments. That means in the framework. but some of these would be reflected in more detail in protocols. Fair allocation of taxing rights, that's proxy for recognition of the market state's right to tax, but also recognition that double taxation is not something that's good. Effective taxation of high net worth individuals, that's a big thing, including in the G20 at the moment, with Brazil very strongly pushing that. Ensuring that tax measures contribute to addressing environmental challenges. This work is founded, as with the Addis Ababa action agenda, is founded very much in the sustainable development context. The tax is not an island in itself. It makes a contribution towards meeting all these other challenges, including environmental challenges and health challenges. Dispute resolution, prevention and resolution, which I think is good for business, it was mentioned in the resolution and it's being discussed, including it was one of the suggestions from the African group, which is leading the charge on many of these things, and capacity building. But they're very clear that capacity building is not enough by itself. The UN shouldn't just be doing capacity building because the norms have to be the right norms. There's no point in capacity building on norms which are not seen as fair. Other possible topics that could be addressed in the protocol, these were mentioned in the resolution, including tax-related illicit financial flows. That will have to be defined a little bit about what they think needs to be pushed, if that is agreed, and also the, not surprisingly, taxation of income derived from the provision of cross-border services, which again was mentioned in the resolution. And of course, this has led to a lot of this, the issues about DSTs in particular, and withholding taxes, which developing countries often feel were not given enough mention in the BEPS. Administrability will be a big issue. Simplicity is a big issue. It's something that both business and developing countries want. Whether they want the same sort of simplicity, I'm not sure, and it's always easier to talk about simplicity than to achieve it. Decision-making remains an issue, and you often hear this expressed in terms of consensus versus majority approaches, but the UN, like the OECD, seeks consensus, but generally, as we've seen in the WTO, you generally need a backup rule, otherwise you have an opportunity to give a veto, and a veto to countries which really don't want anything to happen can occur in that situation. So, as I say, they're seeking consensus, but they have this backup. And the stages of decision-making need to be borne in mind. The rules for the convention will be different from the rules for this ad hoc committee. Convention might very normally provide that a protocol is only adopted as text if it has 2/3 of the participating countries agreeing. And then, of course, you still would have to ratify that for it to affect you as a country. So it's not the case that half the UN membership could bind your legislature. That's just not going to happen. So finally, the takeaways, the process is on track. The pragmatism of the framework protocol approach rather than a broader approach of a general treaty, I think, has been confirmed. And it confirmed the importance of agenda setting as part of the nose-to-tail inclusiveness that's important. Some issues, well, all issues really have to be decided in the next July session. Then you will have the report, and stakeholder engagement is an important part of this. That's clear. I think that's clear from the resolution itself. The OECD work is work that is respected in the resolution itself, but what developing countries, and this is my final point, don't like to be told is you can't enter this garden because the OECD has worked in this area. They, in my experience, are happy to say we have a lot of respect for the OEC's technical ability. We'll look at what they've done, but for this to be a truly inclusive process, we must have the option to look at whether work that's been done elsewhere actually meets the needs of this community. So that's, I think, where the relationship of the work. I'll go back to my slides. And just to say the work of the other UN committee, which is the Committee of Experts, now that we have two, I call it the Committee of Experts, continues. That has a guidance role in all sorts of areas, and that work we expect to continue. So we'll have two UN tax committees, one on guidance, one on continuing the work on terms of reference for the convention, and there'll probably be some sort of negotiating body, whether it's a committee or whether it's some other form. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. So our next speaker is Chenai.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Just to make sure we're all still in the room. As was mentioned, my name is Chenai Mukumba, and I work for an institution called the Tax Justice Network Africa. So we've been following this conversation on the UN Tax Convention for a while, and so are quite pleased, I think, by the developments that are currently taking place. And so what I'm going to be presenting today is really an African perspective with regards to where the conversation is today. And I also say an African perspective because there are a myriad of different views with regards to the UN Tax Convention and what that means. But as an institution that's really been trying to push for this work, what I'm going to present today is some of the thinking that we have around this. In terms of my presentation, I'm going to split it into three. I'm going to begin by giving a bit of historical context, right? So where does all of this come from? Where within sort of the African history with regards to tax, etc., where does the specific conversation on a UN body or a UN platform that works on this stem from? And then the second part of my presentation will focus on where we are today. So I think Michael has laid a really great foundation. So I'll speak to certain aspects that we were privy to during those discussions. And then I'll conclude with where it is that particularly the African group is really hoping to see this particular process land. So by way of historical context, in the early 2000s, there was a lot of work that was starting to be done on this concept of illicit financial flows. So there were a number of academics that were really doing some groundbreaking work, some of whom include Professor Leon Ndikumana, and there were some institutions as well, such as the Global Financial Integrity. And so whilst this discussion was happening, within the continent, there was a desire, at least among some of the ministers of economics, finance, etc., to try and understand what specifically this concept meant on the continent. So at the fourth Joint African Union Commission, African Union/UNECA Commission meeting, the ministers that were present at that meeting mandated the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa to set up a panel to understand exactly what this phenomenon was and what it meant for the African continent. And one of the main reasons for this was because around that time, it was very clear that we were not going to meet the Millennium Development Goals. But it was also very clear that as a continent, there was an amount of wealth that existed within our borders that we weren't fully able to harness. And so in 2011, the ministers that met at that meeting gave UNECA this mandate. This panel was then put together that was chaired by the South African president at the time, His Excellency Thabo Mbeki. And what this panel did was spend a significant amount of time going across the continent, engaging with different stakeholders, and having a number of consultative processes just to understand what were the drivers of illicit financial flows, what were some of the causes, and what are some of the recommendations that essentially would be needed in order to address this scourge. This report was then published in 2015, and what that report did was a number of things. First of all, give an estimate to just how much as a continent Africa was losing. It indicated that it's around $50 billion a year, but even that is quite modest because you can never really fully calculate illicit financial flows. And then what it did is it gave a couple of findings and recommendations to address this scourge. So in terms of how to address illicit financial flows, there were a number of national level recommendations that were put through. So this included, for example, requesting member states, requesting governments to look at their tax incentives regime, asking them to promote, for example, transparency, take a closer look at some of the regimes that, for example, oversee the natural resources sector, right? Because the report indicated that a significant amount of revenue that the African continent was losing was coming from the natural resources sector. But then what the report also did was it gave a number of recommendations that spoke to the international community. So first and foremost, the report indicated that there were a number of different players that were contributing, right, to the various architecture, so to speak, but it noted that there was no coherence. The report also spoke to, for example, the role of donor partners with regards to addressing this bigger scourge of illicit financial flows. It also spoke to the issue of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. But what the report also spoke to, which is where this conversation situates itself, was the need for a UN institution platform, let me go back, that essentially would bring all of this work together. And that's finding 15 that you can see over there. This report was then adopted by the Africa Union in a declaration. And that declaration really sort of adopted the major findings of this high-level panel report, and then specifically under Article 9 there, indicated that drawing from what's been happening and this declaration, in the upcoming Financing for Development agenda, it's important that the African countries that attend that meeting push for a UN institution, platform, etc., to come into play to address this issue of illicit financial flows. And so, drawing from what Michael Lennard just mentioned, at the third Financing for Development Forum, there was a big push in order to see how to begin to establish a UN body. What you can see on the left there is one of the statements that specifically the permanent representative from Morocco gave, indicating the need for this to be an issue that's going to be discussed in Addis Ababa. Unfortunately, due to a number of political issues, the topic itself didn't gain traction. And so as a result, we didn't see this reflected in the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, but needless to say, this became something that the Africa Group decided to run with and champion as a body. I say this noting that developing countries had long been calling for this reform, but specifically this is one of the key milestones, at least from the African perspective, that really brought to the fore this conversation on the UN Tax Convention. Now, there were then a whole host of different activities that took place on the African continent. I'm not going to go through all of them. 15 minutes is not a lot of time. But suffice to say, there were the establishment, for example, of a consortium of different institutions that are tackling this issue of illicit financial flows. There were champion countries such as Nigeria, for example, that was constantly calling for meetings to discuss this topic at the UN. But then what we then saw in 2022 is what I like to call the year of momentum. So in early 2022, the Africa Union established for the first time a subcommittee on tax and illicit financial flows. What's particularly interesting is this committee was established off the back of a meeting that had happened in 2020, where there was an extraordinary session that had been called by the African Union Ministers of Finance. One of the outcomes of this meeting was the establishment of the subcommittee. But what had caused this particular meeting was the developments of the two-pillar solution. And so what I've just cut out there is a little piece that came out from that meeting where the ministers actually put in a document that, and I quote, "The inclusive framework negotiations have made it clear that developed countries are not listening to the concerns of developing countries and have no intention of redressing the balance of taxing rights in any significant way." So this particular meeting took place as the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 conversations happened, and what it said is that we need to start to have an internal conversation around how we want to deal with international with the international tax discussions. Later that year, UNECA then also had a meeting that also brought to the fore this particular conversation. And what we then saw, particularly at the end of the year, was the Africa Group tabling the resolution that we've now come to know as Resolution 77/244. There's a lot of questions about why 2022? There had been a lot of work that had been taking place prior to that, but 2022 was significant for a couple of reasons. Some of you might note that this was round about the time of COVID, and so a number of African countries were thinking through how do we generate resources to address this issue. A number of African countries also found themselves at debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, and so again we're thinking through where can we find domestic resources to address this. Some of you who, again, follow UN processes will also know that around that time, the FACTI panel released a report that flagged the importance of a UN institution to address these things. So it was really a culmination of a whole host of different activities that we feel contributed to what we then saw the Africa Group table in November 2022. I won't talk too much about this bit because I know Michael has referred to it, but what we then saw in 2023 was the Secretary General develop a report at the request of the Africa Group, as was indicated in the resolution, that gave an overview of the international tax system. That report assessed both the UN system as well as the OECD, and at the end of that gave a couple of proposals that member states could consider in terms of moving forward as we start to think through something that could address some of the gaps that we had in the international tax system. So there were 3 proposals offered. The first was a multilateral convention on tax. The second proposal in the report was a framework convention on international tax cooperation. And the third was a UN framework for international tax cooperation. I was privy to be part of the conversations where the Africa Group was trying to think through which of these 3 proposals do they want to take forward. They landed at option 2 because they felt that that one was quite frankly the one that was able to take the best bits of the other 2 options. The first they found too legally binding, and so were concerned that it wouldn't go the stretch that they were hoping to go with this work. And the third one, they found it to be too lax and in essence wouldn't be able to contribute to the reform that they wanted to see. And so this then served as the basis for the resolution that was tabled at the end of 2023 that we now know as Resolution 78-230. But Resolution 78-230 didn't come with its own controversy. At the discussion that was being held to think through the direction that the member states wanted to go, there was an effort to try and water down the expectations. And so there was a proposed amendment that was tabled by the UK at the time, but didn't gain traction, to water it down from a framework convention to just a framework. But this did not pass, and so Nigeria, which was leading this work, tabled the resolution to essentially move forward with the framework convention. What I have here is what the voting looked like. This, for me, I mean, I'm not a big soccer person, but I anticipate, my anticipation of this really felt a lot like what I think, watching a soccer game would look like, just because this is work that we've been supporting for some time. And so what you can see there is that there were 111 countries that voted in favor of the resolution, vis-a-vis 46 that voted against. This particular voting shows you some of the cleavages that currently exist within this discussion. But there's a couple of things that I want to note. So first of all African countries, as you can imagine, voted in favor of this. Also, almost all G77 countries also voted in favor of this, bar 1 or 2. But what we found quite interesting is that 2/3 of OECD Inclusive Framework members also voted in favor of this, reflecting that there may be some dissatisfaction in currently what we see as the main platform where global rules are being made. And so where are we now and what's a potential way forward? Michael already spoke to the meeting that happened at the beginning of the year. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a big discussion about how Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 was historical, right, in terms of reviewing global tax rules. What happened in February for us was an incredibly historical moment, largely because this was the first time there was a platform that, as Michael mentioned, was open-ended for all member states to be able to participate. Part of the frustration of African countries, particularly with the inclusive framework, is that almost half of them are not members, yet often they find themselves subjected to the rules that are being made in that platform. And so as we moved forward and had the first substantive session, we then began to see, I think, the conversations that are really going to serve as the foundation for the next step to this discussion. There were a couple of controversial areas that I'm going to touch on a little bit, and essentially what we think is necessary is a resolving of these issues if we hope to see this UN Framework Convention conversation move forward. So first of all, one of the controversial issues that was discussed during the first substantive session was this one about decision-making. I'm not going into too much detail. I'm not going to go into too much detail because, again, Michael covered this. One of the other controversial issues was this discussion of non-duplication. So a number of developed countries were in the room and thought, yes, we completely support this work, but it's important that there be no duplication with work that's happening elsewhere. Developed countries pushed back and said, but the very reason we are in this room is because the rules that currently exist don't fit many of our contexts and many of our priorities, or we're not able to achieve them. So it's important that all rules be open for consideration. And also, it can't be considered non-duplication because there is no platform where every single country is present and able to contribute to existing conversations. There was also a discussion on the UN Framework Convention and on what issues it should focus on. One of these conversations was the issue of capacity building. A number of developed countries said, this is fantastic, let's use this framework particularly to focus on the capacity building needs that developing countries have. There was a lot of pushback by developing countries because they said, listen, there are certain structural issues that exist within the global tax system, so much so that even if we had all the capacity, if we have no taxing rights, we're not able to generate the resources that we need. And then there was also the question of unfair allocation of taxing rights. This one was a really interesting discussion because a number of developed countries said, we don't know what you're talking about. There is completely fair allocation of taxing rights, to which many developing countries, of course, pushed back and said, you can't say that if we have a system that's obviously based on residence-based rules. And then as I conclude, one of the other conversations that was had in the session that concluded in the first session was that on protocols, right? Should we be discussing protocols at the same time as the Framework Convention, or should we complete the Framework Convention and then discuss protocols? Developing countries pushed and said it's important that we discuss protocols as soon as possible. The reason for this was that the Framework Convention will give a really great foundation for these discussions, but where we're actually going to see decisions that affect revenue is within the protocols. And so right now there's a conversation about, okay, so if we do protocols, what are the topics we should be covering? And as Michael mentioned, taxation of cross-border services is one of those. Taxation of the digital economy is one of those that countries are currently thinking through. So as I conclude, I was having a conversation with somebody the other day, and they said it's not quite clear what African countries want from this. And I think it's important to note that dating back, as I indicated, almost 2 decades ago, what African countries want is a platform that they are able to contribute to, one that is democratic, one that is inclusive, one that is participatory. And they're of the view that the UN is one way of getting there. They don't speak from a position of ignorance. I think we all know that even the UN is fraught with certain issues. But it's definitely a step in the direction that they want to see, particularly as far as creating a body, a platform, an institution that's able to bring together the various institutions that comprise this international tax framework. And as I mentioned, I went back as far as 2011 when this discussion started, but really developing countries have been asking for this for much, much longer. And I know that this is what Philip Baker is going to touch on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chenai. That was fantastic. And the third speaker is Philip.
Right. I'm just going to get move on to the slides. There we go. Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, rather. And thank you very much indeed to the organisers. I think my colleagues in Oxford asked me to speak here for one particular reason, and that is I've been observing the UN activities now for probably closer to 40 years rather than 30. I think I first wandered into a meeting of what was then the ad hoc committee of experts at the UN, probably when I was doing my doctoral research about 40 years ago. And I've sort of kept attending, usually at least once a year, the committee of experts since then. It's become a kind of religious activity, particularly when the committee is meeting in Geneva. I kind of feel that I have to go over and attend, partly because I suppose I sort of have this religious sense that there must be a higher power in international tax. And maybe if one attends the UN meetings, some of the things that one would like to happen might happen. And like I suppose many religious activities, one comes away with a little bit of a sense of disappointment that one's prayers are not answered, and a sense of being unrequited. And I think I'm probably in that sense at the present moment. I think possibly, if you forgive me for commenting a little bit, Michael is giving you, I think, the very much the neutral civil servant within the UN structure view. Chenai has given you an optimistic view. I think this is probably going to be the rather pessimistic view, I'm afraid. And I thought what I would do is... Oh, you were optimistic as well, actually. Well, you sometimes have to be optimistic there. But I wanted to try to address two questions here, both of which I think are ones that are not often asked, need to be answered. And the first question is, what are the success criteria for a UN framework convention? What is one actually looking for? What is one hoping to achieve? Arguably, one of the failures of the OECD work of the last 15 years has not been to set the success criteria, either for BEPS 1.0 or for BEPS 2.0. I thought BEPS 2.0 was supposed to increase the tax collection, particularly for developing countries, but it seems from earlier today that actually that expectation is not going to be met, and that there are other objectives that maybe weren't voiced. So I think it's important to set the question of what are the success criteria, and then perhaps linking to my slightly pessimistic view, or perhaps more than slightly pessimistic, is there a plan B, or at least a plan A dash for the UN work? So let me just try in the time available to have a little word about those. So what are the success criteria? And focusing at the moment just on the procedural side of getting the framework convention off the ground. I'm not even trying to look beyond that to what protocols might be adopted and what the long-term effect may be. Just in terms of the actual convention, is the aim to have a convention which all countries will join? I mean, that's the ideal. This is the UN. We want to have it to be inclusive. So do we want to have all countries joining, in which case the approach that one would take might be very different in order to try and have everyone on board? Are we happy to have all countries bar one? Perhaps not identifying what that one country might be, but maybe one of the narratives behind the UN work is to have tax developments proceeding on a basis that we don't have to wait for the outcome of the US election before we know whether or not something is proceeding. And so maybe an institution that, if it can, operates with all countries bar one, might be a success criteria. Is it sufficient if we end up with a structure that only has the global south involved, and that we end up with a effectively split position where you have on the one hand the global south participating through the Framework Convention, and on the other hand the OECD and EU countries perhaps continuing with the OECD and a sort of reduced, perhaps inclusive framework. And I'm beginning to hear from some people that third option might possibly be the success criteria, that as long as the Global South holds together. Now, putting that in the context of the discussions that took place earlier this year in New York, in keeping with my religious devotion, I watched on UN TV most of the days of the last sessions of the ad hoc committee. I should say the advantage of watching on UN TV is that you don't have to go to New York. And secondly, there's a fast forward button there. I watched most of that there, and with an increasing sense of depression, because what Chenai referred to as the controversial areas were pretty much everything that was discussed. Decision-making kept on coming back and back again. The non-duplication of the work that's going on at the OECD. I even thought that issues, I thought there wouldn't be any real controversy about capacity building or domestic resource mobilization, but as Chenai said, those are controversial issues for many of the countries. Increasingly, it looked as though one was watching, well, it has to be a football analogy, John, one was watching a football match with two teams, but with the members of the teams coming along and declaring which side they were playing for in the auditorium there. And I think that there is a real danger evident from those discussions that there is such a huge chasm between the Global South and the OECD EU countries, that it is going to take an almost impossible task of creating the bridge between that chasm. I'm not particularly looking forward to the 16 days in July and August. Again, I recommend watching it on UN TV rather than actually going to there. But I do worry that at the end of that time, even on the terms of reference, there will be such a huge chasm. Key issues will end up having to go to votes. The Global South will win, but then you end up with terms of reference that the EU OECD countries cannot sign up to. That leads me to ask, if you are looking for success criteria, is there a preferred outcome? And I'll express very clearly what my preferred outcome is, and that is that we somehow do bridge that chasm, and that we do end up with a UN structure that attracts at least a sufficient coalition of countries. And that's not just the Global South, but the UN. We talked about consensus, we talked about majority. Actually, my experience with the UN is that the UN works through a coalition of regional groupings. And enough regions support this that there is a workable solution to the problem of international tax coordination, and that we don't end up with just a purely Global South. Linked with that, I would hope that there is a recognition that there are 4 intergovernmental organizations operating in international tax. There is the UN, there is the OECD, there is the IMF, and there is the World Bank, and that there has to be, going forward, a coordination of the work between those bodies. No one body dominates over the others. There is a coordination to avoid duplication, and that coordination will ultimately have to have an element of political oversight. I hope, again, going back to my religious belief here, I hope that that's what we end up with. I'm not certain that it is going to be the preferred outcome. So let me turn then to my second question, and that is, if we don't end up with a framework convention at all, or if it isn't what we hope it's going to be, is there a plan B, or at least a variation of plan A, which achieves something? Again, I have a strong belief that you should always have a plan B. To my mind, one of the failures of BEPS 2.0 is that there wasn't the fallback of a coordinated DST approach, which I think came up from the previous discussion. That would have been an alternative plan B. it's important, I think, in the context of the UN to have a plan B. So is there a fallback if the Framework Convention doesn't succeed, or it simply takes too long? That the number of years that it takes to get to a point where there is a Framework Convention that's agreed and that comes into force, countries simply cannot wait that long. I mean, we are already looking at this year for the terms of reference, 2 years for negotiating the Framework Convention. I think that means that it won't be open to signature until 2027, probably at the earliest, maybe not into force until, could be 2030. That's too long. Things can't wait that long. I'll make a little very quick tangential comment here, and that is, I'm not entirely convinced that the choice of a Framework Convention was actually the optimal choice. Using the parallel of the climate change Framework Convention probably in retrospect wasn't a very good idea, because for two reasons. Firstly, a Framework Convention requires that up front you negotiate the principles, the objectives, and that's why we're having so much controversy at the beginning. It also requires states to sign up. And so you won't know until the end of the day whether you're actually going to be successful or not. And so a lot of effort could be spent over years for something that doesn't actually effectuate. And Pillar 1 is clearly an example of that. So, given that we have got the Framework Convention, is there a plan B? And very quickly, I will put forward, if I may, my plan A dash, I suppose, rather than a plan B, which is something that is compatible with a Framework Convention, but also an alternative if the Framework Convention never gets off the ground. If that's my wife, I'll ring her back. We often forget in this context that there was, for a short-lived time, a single body leading on international tax in the UN, and that was after the Second World War. There was a UN Fiscal Commission that existed between 46 and 54, and it was set up intending that it would continue the work of the League of Nations, which, as you know, developed the international tax principles between the two world wars. It was an intergovernmental commission, representatives of governments, quite a small number at the time because the UN was much smaller. It was a functional commission under the Economic and Social Council of the UN. And just for those who don't know the structure, the UN has a number, I think the number at the moment is about 12, functional commissions that operate under ECOSOC and carry out very important social and economic work in particular areas. For example, the Commission on the Status of Women was set up roughly the same time as the Fiscal Commission and leads in the UN work on the status of women. It developed, for example, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. That came out of that commission. There's the Commission on Human Rights, which is where I first got involved in UN work, which developed many of the rules on our body of human rights law and eventually ended up being elevated to the level of the Human Rights Council of the UN at the same level as ECOSOC and the General Assembly. These functional commissions are intergovernmental, unlike the Committee of Experts. They typically involve 40 to 50 countries chosen to represent the world's regions. The UN has a very established system for balancing between the different regions, and they operate both through the Intergovernmental Commission and also through subcommissions, working groups, etc. And in a number of areas, like human rights, they have been very successful. How would the re-establishment of the Fiscal Commission fit in with the Framework Convention? Well, the Framework Convention already mentions the idea that there will be subsidiary bodies, that there will have to be, for example, a body with a number of governments, say 40 to 50, operating on a more regular basis. So why could that not be the Fiscal Commission, which could be set up now, but then if the Framework Convention is achieved, it slots in underneath that as one of the subsidiary bodies. Setting up the Fiscal Commission requires only a resolution of ECOSOC. If you look back in the history, the original Fiscal Commission, the resolution that set it up was a one-pager. The Commission is set up to assist the UN on the work on international tax. You don't have to negotiate objectives, principles, just set down a very general statement. The Fiscal Commission would be a UN charter body rather than a treaty body. For those of you who know the UN system, you will know that charter bodies exist under the UN Charter. They do not require member states to sign up to them. Because you're a member of the UN, you can participate in any charter body activity. So you don't need to wait to see whether countries will sign up to this. And it could begin its work pretty much immediately, including working towards those protocols, which will eventually become, if there is a framework convention, they will be the product of the framework convention. Many of those protocols need work now to think about what the solutions might be. We talk about a protocol on illicit financial flows. But how are we going to deal with illicit financial flows? Work needs to be done now on what might be the solutions, what might be done, so that it can then be taken into the work, into the protocol. Finally then, are there arguments against the idea of setting up the Fiscal Commission, resetting it up now? Well, it was wound up in 1954 after 8 years. So you might say to me, well, Philip, that's not a very good example of something. I mean, if it was closed down after 8 years, why would it be any more successful now? We know a lot more about the history of the Fiscal Commission, partly through the work of a young Australian academic, Nicky Teo, who's very elaborately explained the history, and we can identify what the problems were. And after 70 years, we now have a lot of experience from UN bodies to deal with those issues, which led to the Commission being wound up after 8 years. It was wound up for a whole series of reasons, one of them being Cold War tension, one of them being tension with the civil service within the UN. We now know how to deal with those issues. So I think we can learn from history, and there's no reason to assume that it will be wound up again so soon. One argument that's been put to me about this is that for many countries, resources are already hugely stretched by the number of international organizations to which representation has to be sent. Governments are sending people to the OECD, to the Inclusive Framework. If you're in Europe, you're sending them to Brussels. Now you're sending them to the UN, to the ad hoc committee. This is just one more demand on the very stretched resources of countries. And I can't deny that that will be the case, that setting this up now. But if we are going to see eventually work coming out from the UN, additional resources are going to have to be committed to that purpose. And if they're going to be committed in the longer term, perhaps governments need to start gearing up to that now, because useful work can be commenced at an earlier stage on what might become either the subject matter for protocols or might have independent. So I haven't yet heard any convincing arguments against this idea of a Plan A- resurrecting the UN Fiscal Commission. But maybe now is the time to open it up to questions, and maybe somebody will say, oh no, Philip, you've totally missed a point, in which case my religious belief in the UN will once again be shattered. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. So we ran over a little bit, so we only have about 20 minutes for questions. And unfortunately, that means I can't draw my analogy with Gareth Southgate not having a plan B, it seems. Okay, so I also want to ask Chenai and Michael if they would like to respond to Philip's questions, but we'll do that at the end of the session. But we'll start first with questions from the floor.
Hello, colleagues. Many thanks for such an interesting discussion. I'm Olesya Kiseleva, alumni, Oxford Masters of Taxation alumni, and also in-house tax director. And I'm responsible for around 30 countries in developing countries. So this topic is very much close to what I do on a daily basis. So few remarks and one question. The question, well, few remarks first. I think the question about or debate about fair allocation of taxing rights was there between developed and developing countries for what, decades now. And although this question is, again, is a debate and probably will stay a debate for another decade, on a practical basis, on a day-to-day basis, I see a lot that tax administrations in the developing countries tackle this, unfair allocation by doing local deductibility tests, by imposing rigorous documentation requirements, by imposing stricter, standards of tax audits, which are way far, kind of not the standards which OECD audits will do, like unreasonable or very strict kind of, not substance-based, but form-based audits, let me put it like this. So, and there are, of course, local rules about deductibility, limitations on certain expenses. So you can basically bring back your taxing rights but by implementing a lot of local rules. And that's what we see. It's there already. So, and I can say that we effectively, in some of the developing countries, in Africa or Latin America, we sometimes pay like huge amount of like our effective tax rate sometimes is like huge compared to revenue. We would not see this on OECD. So we already, kind of, the local rules are there already constructed in such a way that you get sometimes very high stake compared to revenue. So, and although there is a debate on a theoretical basis, again, on a practical basis for business, we are way more interested in how you're going to build capacity, how you're going to develop your tax authorities to make sure we can speak to them on the same language. They can understand, again, kind of TP guidelines, they can kind of understand multinationals. So for me, I know again there is a theoretical debate, but capacity building should not be linked to this debate, to the resolution of this, because it can help us and it can help administrations to even achieve the same goal on kind of on practical basis. Sorry, it's a very long question. But the question is about capacity building and where are you on this? And
I'd like to take questions in pairs. So one more question. John, can you pass the microphone?
Thank you very much. John Snape at the University of Warwick. Thank you very much, Chenai, Michael and Philip. That was a very detailed, very thought-provoking session, and I'm just wondering if I can just gather my thoughts together. Let me see if I can put an intelligible question to you. I was very arrested by the point that Michael made in his presentation, that when he was discussing the possible matters to be included in the terms of reference for a framework convention. And he said that possible topics for inclusion could include capacity building, but not just capacity building. It was also about getting the right taxation norms. And that point was picked up obliquely both by Chenai and also by Philip as well. And I was wondering if one or more of you could briefly speak a little bit to that rather rich interaction of factors. Thank you very much again, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, so Chenai and Michael, would you like to respond to either of the two questions? Start with Michael.
Yeah, very, very briefly. The first one is, oh, sorry. Do I have to press the button? No, I don't. Yeah, the first question is, well, I'll go to the second question first. There's a bit of a background to this, and in brief, the background is that a lot of the response to this call for the UN to have a bigger role in this area was to say, yes, we agree the UN should have a bigger role. It should be doing more in capacity development. And that was seen as completely missing the point. because the point that was being made, everyone agrees capacity building is important, and not just capacity building on good norms, fair norms, but also in terms of negotiation. I think there's an increasing awareness that multilateral negotiation is something we're not all used to. But it was used as a sort of a way of shoveling off the UN role to be just capacity development on received norms. And that's not what the push was about. The push was about to have norms which are regarded as fairer, are regarded as more administrable. This relates a bit to the first question, so I'll answer that too. That the sense that capacity building is important, but the norms themselves have to be administrable. I gave the example that a lot of developing countries, the UN Tax Committee, put in a submission as a whole, which is unusual. Developed and developing country people saying that as part of BEPS, withholding taxes should be seriously considered. And we thought there was a lot of opportunity in BEPS to say, well, how can we have better withholding tax systems for all stakeholders? You know, those are two elements of those two questions. And just sort of relating to both of them, in my view, it's in the interests of business to have a higher satisfaction in developing countries, not just because they're their markets, but also as a matter of internation equity than we have at the moment. And I think, I don't see it as all developing countries against developed countries. If you look at the voting, you'll see that some OECD countries in the end voted for this resolution. So there are bridge builders there between the developed and developing country interests. So I don't think you have to have a convention that every country agrees to. Certainly I think having a convention that would require every country in the world to ratify it would be, for all the reasons we know, a very dangerous thing. But you need those bridge builders, which I think we'll start to see in the July-August session. That's why I'm optimistic, Philip.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I completely agree with Michael. So the topic of capacity building was incredibly controversial, and I think similar to what Michael said, a lot of, I mean, we talk very broad-based, right? So developed country, but a lot of developing countries saw that as an effort to, I guess in a sense, derail the conversation and then subject the UN process solely to its capacity building function. And so because of that, there was a lot of pushback. I hear your point around there are a number of things that countries can do at national level to adjust sort of taxing rights and allocation. But I think the question here is that they're implementing these rules in order to counter what exists at an international level, which is what a lot of this discussion is about, right? The current norms, and how to make those be the ones that are essentially prevalent and developing countries needing to address. I think the other thing that I would flag is that the capacity building element that developing countries did say perhaps might be necessary is, as Michael mentioned, the agenda setting one, right? Because largely they've been excluded from many of these platforms, and in fact, they find themselves in a situation whereby if they want to participate in agenda setting, for example, at the Inclusive Framework, they have to take on a number of rules that they themselves did not participate in and may not actually be a priority for them, right? So capacity building in that sense at the UN is one of the areas that they thought was necessary. And then I think thirdly, the last point I'd like to flag is that the question of capacity building speaks to helping developing countries achieve certain standards. One of the critiques of what has come out from the OECD in the past years, as was also mentioned in the Secretary General's report, was that these standards are sometimes too complex, too technical, and too difficult for developing countries. And because of that, they're not cognizant of their specific contexts, right? And so part of the pushback against capacity building is that some of what we actually need to be doing is ensuring that we have rules that we're able to achieve and subsequently may not need as much capacity building to achieve, right? So I think that would be some of my responses to the two questions.
I mean, I would argue that the rules are too complex for developed countries as well. So we have two more questions here. So we have Heather. Yeah, you can start there, Nicholas.
Thank you. Philip talked about a plan A- and a plan B. This is a question about a plan C. I think it was in 2013, just looking back at previous programmes, I had the temerity to speak about BEPS in Africa before anybody else had done much thinking about it, which is perhaps just as well. But one of the things I want to come back to is the question of if there are going to be delays on the UN process and others, what could less developed countries, particularly in Africa, do themselves to improve their domestic resource mobilisation, improve their tax take? And for example, should they be looking more at royalties on natural resources?
Hi, Jeff Vanderwalk from Squire Patton Boggs. Just quickly for Philip, it wasn't quite clear to me from your comments about the Fiscal Commission whether you saw that as potentially a better forum for something that might bridge the chasm between the OECD countries and the Global South.
Okay, quick answer so we can have another round. So, Chenai, would you like to start?
Yeah. I mean, I'll respond specifically from an African context. I'm not sure about the other regions, but what we're seeing, at least within the African context, is a move towards trying to use the regional platform, right? And so, for example, I know a lot of what was mentioned by Manal in terms of developing country sort of expectations being pushed within the OECD framework. A lot of that work was done by the Africa Tax Administration Forum. And what we're actually starting to see happen on the continent is increased collaboration between them as well as the African Union, which sort of oversees, sort of the political dimension of all of these conversations. So in the interim, I think there's a world in which developing countries can work together regionally to begin to push back against certain things as well as establish certain measures. And definitely royalties, I know, based on some conversations I was having earlier, is something that they would be considering.
In answer to Jeff's point, yes, I think potentially it could be, because the Fiscal Commission would be an intergovernmental commission that starts to work on some of the solutions rather than the objectives and the principles. Leave those to be debated, possibly without any agreement, through the Framework Convention. But if, for example, the issue of illicit financial flows is seen to be one of the problems, I think generally it's accepted, we need to start asking, well, okay, what can we do that is not being done already to deal with that? Similarly, there is a lot of work on some of the issues that are being talked about, like cross-border services, digitalized economy, that's already going on within the UN Committee of Experts, but there isn't an intergovernmental body to say, right, of the different solutions you've come up with, we go for A rather than B. So yes, I can see that starting to work on practical issues may allow less of a focus on the big commitments and more on what we can actually do. So yes, I do see it as a potential bridge. Does that answer your question?
Okay, last round of questions. So Niels and the lady over there, behind you, Christopher.
Niels Johannessen, Center for Business Taxation. So Chenai, your presentation highlighted that a lot of the impetus to this process came from these concerns about illicit financial flows. And so actually, like in the meanwhile, a lot of progress has been done in the OECD, like in terms of, for example, the common reporting standard, where like most developing countries are not part of that. So I guess like so the countries could now, like by signing up to that standard, they could actually receive lists of, like all accounts beneficially owned from their countries, like in major tax havens, and could use that to mitigate these problems. And they don't. And I'm just interested in your perspective on why is that an example of like norms being too complex or too expensive to implement, or what is going on? Thanks.
So there's one final question there, Christopher.
My question is, in the context of the digital economy, it might be too far-sighted, but I think it's something worth thinking about. In the context of digital economy, is the UN planning to discuss anything about the taxing rights in the metaverse? Because I believe, with my limited understanding and reading, that it could be the next new tax haven, especially after Pillar 2 and the minimum rate. And UN could have a first mover's advantage if it thinks about it and does something about it, has a discussion about it. So is that part of the agenda? My question might be far-sighted, but it is the future. Metaverse is the future.
Well, thinking about the metaverse as a tax haven makes me feel old. Okay, so I think it's Chenai. Would you like to go first?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is, again, they're estimates, but the issue of illicit financial flows on the continent actually seems to be worsening. So recent statistics, again, estimates, but indicate that there's been a doubling since sort of this first report was done. So I think the question of whether the current system and some of the measures that are currently in place, whether they're efficient and effective in trying to address this issue from an African perspective, I think is one that's still sort of begs question. In response to your question, I think the point that a number of developing countries flag is that whilst there are a number of sort of recommendations that have been put forward, and I think you kind of alluded to it, not all of them have the capacity to meet those standards, but then also sometimes, I think, like I've mentioned, they find themselves on blacklists for not having implemented certain standards that they don't think are a priority, which then sort of negatively affects them in that sense. So whilst there is, and I mentioned earlier, definitely a regime and certain measures that exist to help address this issue of illicit financial flows, it's proven to not be wholly effective. And in actual fact, we see a worsening of the problem in spite of some of the measures that exist.
Michael is happy to take the question on the metaverse.
Yes, I'm not that experienced in it, but the answer is the UN is member state driven. I haven't detected at the moment a call for that. Perhaps as more younger people get involved in our work, which is something that the Secretary General is seeking, there'll be a new committee of experts next year. I think more likely is something I see a lot now, the question of, and it could of course be done through this process at some stage, but I think more likely is the issue of the impact of artificial intelligence on developing country tax administration to give my perception, but it's member state driven, it's not secretariat driven, so who knows?
So I'm going to ask Michael and Chenai if they'd like to respond to Philip's two questions briefly, very briefly. So what would constitute success and what they would like, whether you're thinking about a plan B. But Philip, before doing so, is there anything you'd like to respond to which has come up?
No, let's let...
Okay, so...
But can I have a right of reply, maybe, to Michael?
Okay. People are also getting hungry, so
yes.
It's, we have lunch waiting for us. But Chenai?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have more questions than sort of responses to Philip. I think for me, the Fiscal Commission looks like an option where groups that are interested in a certain thing could go and work, right? And I think based off of your assessment of where the Framework Convention is, it's very likely that we're also going to see a situation where, worst case scenario, right? Global South countries are the ones that sign up onto a thing and potentially be the ones that identify the protocol and potentially ratify that. How different are those two options?
Michael? Good. They are very different, partly because one is a charter body and one is a treaty body. The charter body means that all countries in the UN can participate, and it is unlikely that, say, the European countries would not send delegates along and not participate in a UN commission. They might not participate so actively, whereas the possibility stroke probability is that the European stroke OECD countries will never sign up to the Framework Convention. That's a big difference between being there because it's a UN body and not being there at all. And I think the danger is we end up in a not being there at all situation. And that's part of the reason why I do query whether right at the beginning the right decision was taken to go to a framework convention as opposed to saying what's already within the UN. I think it's probably, it's unfortunate that perhaps some of the people who were discussing this had not taken principles of international tax at the MSc, because as you know, Chenai, those who take that learn all about the UN Fiscal Commission, and they would immediately have said, thinking about a framework convention, we want to revive the Fiscal Commission there. Or they would have had Plan C, and I don't think we've actually given an answer to Heather's question about what can be done in the interim. I would just very quickly, I promise this last thing I will say. There were a number of very scary things I found on Manal's slides, but one of the things that really scared the pants off of me was the slide that showed the Sustainable Development Goals and the fact that only 1/2 of the amount that is needed is presently being obtained from taxation, and I cannot see how tax systems can be adjusted to get that other half. That was, and I don't know that anything that's being discussed in terms of Pillar 1, Pillar 2, or any number of pillars is ever going to answer that problem, and that's the thing that really scared me.
Yeah, just a brief response to Philip's comments. On the first, what does success look like? I think the bilateral system of tax treaties is very out of time in terms of how it operates, and also it's very, very hard to update. There's some moves within the UN to try to speed that up, and Philip's been assisting. But I think success means a widely accepted convention that is ratified because it's seen as having legitimacy, not because of pressure, but because it's seen as having a widespread legitimacy. Not every country needs to join it. Great conventions like the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, there's still some notable holdouts, although it probably applies to them, a lot of it is customary international law. And that means you don't have to have every country on board, and you don't have to assume every country will join immediately. When it's seen to work in practice, other countries will join. On the plan A, B and C, I do remember when Pascal said we have no plan B and plan C is chaos. I always thought they must have had a plan B, whether they did or not, I don't know. In what they used to call in American defence circles the skunk works, where I think Northrop had all the secret things. But from our point of view, I think at this stage, we really should be emphasising plan A, but we should be aware that it is a challenge and it will take compromises on both sides, but those compromises shouldn't be such that there's no heart left in the agreement. You don't just compromise for compromise's sake. That's why it's valuable that there is the voting requirement at the back of consensus. And as always in the UN, hopefully it doesn't have to be used, and if it has to be used, hopefully it's at least 2/3 of countries. And as with the last one, some OECD countries actually see the merit of having developing countries feel there's legitimacy in the system and come along with it. So that's why I am ultimately optimistic but cautiously so. Thank you.
Okay, please join me in thanking the speakers.